5 years. Obviously, there'll be a committee. Hello, welcome back. Thanks for being so prompt back from the break. For our last hour of testimony together before the meeting break. Let's make it fabulous.
Fabulous.
So there have been, thank you so much. You just made it fabulous on your very own. So there have been many conversations over the years, including this year, about the challenges of having the non-homestead property tax category be so profoundly broad. And I, at least, have experienced massive misunderstandings with the public about it, right? A lot of people think non-homestead means a second home. And then I go into this long thing about how it includes everything from a camp to a second home, to a parking lot, to a field, to a affordable rental property. And we heard calls for sort of a land value tax. We've heard conversations about a second homes tax. We've heard conversations about a need to reduce property taxes for rental properties, all kinds of things. Right now, under existing law, we have no mechanism to do anything about that or understand anything about it. And so as sort of part of this massive property tax reform proposal we are working on, I asked Kirby to draft language to divide up the non-homestead categories. So he's going to share that with us today. It is very much a starting point. Other states do this. And so asked him to base that work off of some work that's done in New York and Hawaii and a few other places. But definitions are sort of famously hard in legislation. And so just want to sort of name this as a work in progress, and we are going to iterate it abundantly over the next few weeks. And with that, Kirby, do you want to join us? Given that we have an hour, I'm going to ask Kirby to go through sort of the big picture construct and through the language, and let's try to really like get our heads around the whole thing before we pick it apart. Sound good? Okay. Don't worry, there will be time to pick it apart.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Kirby Keaton, Legislative Counsel.
Sorry, I want to have one more caveat. So we're going to get the big picture, have time to understand it, and then we all have a full week to digest it so that when we come back together, we can really dig in and do what we need to do to improve it. Okay, Kirby, sorry.
So what we're going to look at, big picture, is an idea that's inspired by Hawaii, this draft. In putting it together, it's different.
California?
No, in this case, it's the part that's inspired on Hawaii, off of Hawaii, is that in Hawaii, there's 4 counties that classify their properties very specifically so that they can, in turn, have a tax rate that's unique to each of those types of properties. So start having like tailored tax rates based on how that property is used. And so the inspiration from Hawaii is really that, the ability for Vermont to possibly do that, to instead of under our current system, we have the homestead and we have the non-homestead rates and we have the yields that go with those. And those are our kind of 2 categories right now that we base education property tax on. This could feasibly set Vermont up to, especially when it comes to those non-homestead properties, to start to fine tune the tax liability for different groups within that non-homestead category.
And while Hawaii is very different from here culturally, and well, I've never been there and I wish I was going there. They do have an incredibly high proportion of second homes, a high proportion of resort properties. And so there are sort of a lot of commonalities between the strangeness of their grand list that's actually similar to our grand lists compared to other states in the country that have just sort of a much steadier mix of residential.
Yes, and we'll be looking at what this language has for classification, and many of them are similar to Hawaii because of the reasons that the chair just mentioned. So getting into the language a little bit, the first section amends the section of law on the contents of the grand list. Really, what this draft does is it makes some alterations to the contents of the grand list, and then it adds a section after that in law to further elaborate on the classification concept. So at the bottom of the first page, we have, these are the things that have to be included on the grand list. And one thing that already has to be included is a brief description of each parcel of taxable real estate in the town. This old-fashioned language, town means municipality here. So, including a classification assigned pursuant to section 4152A of this title. So there's just, our grand list will have a statutory classification on the grand list. And the rest of that is the same.
So you said town is the same meaning as municipality over Rose. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And I know since we've been looking at a lot of this old language in this area, like one of these days I'll change all the words to be the right words. But for now, we have a lot on our plates, right? Okay, so then we have a new section 4152A, which will come right after the grand list content section. And it'll start establishing this statewide system for property classifications. So first, the grand list of a town shall include one assigned classification for each parcel of real estate. I might need to actually massage that language because when it comes to mixed use, we'll get into it. There's some proportionality when there's mixed uses, and we'll get into that. But the idea is that the grand list will have an assigned classification and will be one of the ones that are in law here. And then there's directions about how they are to be classified. This is not intending to change what's being done right now in a fitting way. The Lister's Handbook that PBR publishes has a lot of instructions to guide listers and assessors in putting it to categorize different property types on the grand list as it is. It's something that they're doing. It's just not something that's used in a very meaningful way for state law. And so it's very informal, and there's not a lot of work that's done to make sure that that's completely standard across the state. It's more of a kind of informal data collection is the way that I see how that's being used right now. And the idea is to do something not that dissimilar to what's already being done, but just making it more standardized. And following what the law here says to do it. Definitely no intent to value or to consider properties any differently than looking at the highest and best use of the parcel. That's how property valuation is done. That is the best practice. That's what Vermont does. That's what most jurisdictions do. That's what, IAAO will tell you to do. There's a provision here, though, that when considering the classifications, this is something that comes out of one of the counties in Hawaii, that they'll also consider relevant municipal ordinances, bylaws, or regulations. We might hear feedback that that's not even a necessary provision because, if you're looking at highest and best use, you're going to look at the local ordinances and things like that, because that necessarily goes into highest and best use. So maybe it's not necessarily to have that. Like I said, that was added because it's part of what Hawaii does. And then other considerations such as any rules adopted by the commissioner. I think the assumption here is that we're not going to be able to put in statute every little situation that could possibly exist for how property is used. But we are going to want standard approach to classifying them. So by necessity, there's probably going to need to be some additional rules put out by the Department of Taxes and PBR to further flesh out what we have in statute here. So those are the things all taken into account when deciding how to classify. Moving on, let's get into like the actual real meat of it, right? What are the classifications in this draft? There's something called residential A, there'll be something called residential B. Apartment will be its own category, which is different than how we would classify things right now under the Lister's Handbook, because apartments are generally put in with residential or commercial, but it would have its own category with its own definition. Again, these things all are designed to, just like with Hawaii, link back to being able to have a tax rate for a non-homestead tax rate specific to these categories. So what categories you have here is a policy decision about what you want to tax differently, right? That's the logic here. It's not a property valuation reason necessarily for this. It's a, how do you want to tax things? How do you want to tailor your tax system reason? So apartment is one, affordable housing is one, commercial, which is of course typical in property valuation. Resort is its own category, inspiration from Hawaii and with the similarities between Vermont and Hawaii that the chair mentioned before. Industrial is one, undeveloped land, and public use. So those are the categories we have, or classifications specifically we have right now.
How do you understand the difference between, say, an inexpensive primary residence and affordable housing?
I think we will get to that.
Oh,
Yeah, we have definitions
see.
to start with here. Some of these, well, let's talk about affordable housing. It's the next thing.
There you go.
So we have a definition for affordable housing, and this is a discrete thing that's based off of current law. When it comes to, in current law, there's somewhat obscure provision that allows a reduction in property value for affordable housing with a definition. And so we've used that for this. So affordable housing means residential rental units that are subject to rent restriction under provisions of state or federal law, excluding units subject to rent restrictions under only one of the following programs. That's Section 8, Section 236, Section 505. And under current law, you have VHFA involved in verifying which properties should be considered affordable housing in this case and which should not. And we've retained that. One difference is under current law, the way this is used is it's something that's kind of a rolling thing that VHFA would check in on every 10 years or less if anything happened in between. This is drafted so that it's every year having like basically a list, VHFA producing a list of under this definition, these are the affordable housing properties that exist. And they would be able to hand that off to PVR, who could in turn make sure that these are marked on the grand list and classified this way.
And we spent some time on that provision last year for folks who were here to just remember.
So it might be that this language might need to be massaged, but I think as a concept, that's something that we can easily identify, and there should probably not be any controversy around what's affordable housing and what's not, taking this approach to it. Not a lot of subjectivity there. Second definition is for apartment. These are alphabetical. So the definition we have for apartment now is a parcel or portion of a parcel improved with one or more dwelling units and occupied by long-term tenants for a period of 11 consecutive months or more. What you want to determine as a long-term rental is a policy choice. The policy choice in this language is 11 months. So not a full year lease, but just about that. But that's where the line is drawn for what makes an apartment. It's a long-term rental and for at least 11 consecutive months. And then that brings us into commercial, which is going to be a lot of types of different things. It starts with how the Lister handbook approaches generally what commercial means. A parcel or portion of a parcel used for business activity. Business activity is basically the thing that makes commercial. And that does not qualify for classification as an apartment, residential A, residential B, or industrial under this subsection. Parcels with a commercial classification shall include, and this could be something where even more elaboration as we think of different uses of a parcel or different uses of a property to specify. But some things that are elaborated on and specified here is units that are not part of a homestead and are used for lodging for periods of less than 11 consecutive months. Basically, if you've got a short-term rental out of your house, the portion that's that short-term rental would go as commercial, it would not go as residential under the way this is structured. Property used as timeshares would be called commercial because there could be, that's right there expressed because there could be some debate about what is a timeshare? Is it a resort? Is it residential? You know, so it just says it right there. Those are going to be just thrown in as commercial. And again, I was going to keep reminding you that these definitions and the way that you put things into different buckets has to do with your tax policy, how you want to apply property tax. The next specification under commercial here is lodging establishments that are licensed as hotels or bed and breakfasts, except for those that qualify as resort, which we'll get to that definition in a minute. Office buildings, and then property and improvements used primarily in the business of farming, calling that out because there's going to be questions about what's a farm? What do you do with the farm? And farm parcels could be very complicated here because they're often mixed use just because they're residential. Parts of them are commercial, parts of them are undeveloped land. So that can become complicated, and we want to set up a system, of course, where the listers on the ground can figure out how to put those pieces together for each parcel. The next category is industrial. This is the general definition, the one that would be used in the lister's handbook now, and the one that I've seen in other jurisdictions where a property that's used in the production and fabrication of durable and non-durable goods, that is your general plain meaning industrial across jurisdictions, and then specifying manufacturing plants, electric utilities, other utilities, and more property types to be added there for clarification purposes. The fifth definition is for public use. This draft ties public use properties to the current education property tax exemptions in Vermont. If it's exempt from education tax, it would be classified as public use. I think that's a discrete definition. Again, since those properties are going to be exempt, if you keep this definition, I could only assume that that would mean that the tax rate you use is 0 for this category, for this classification, because they're exempt. But this is something that other jurisdictions use as a category. Some call it public service or something else. Hawaii has this, and the counties that I'm remembering at the moment anyway have a 0% tax rate for public use properties. So it's one that's in the draft.
So just to clarify these would be properties like the town clerk's office and cemeteries and through the Grange.
And yeah, public pious charitable exemptions,
Sure.
like every exemption that we already have. Those would be put into public use. If it would not be the municipal voted exemptions. It would be just the statewide exemptions, because the municipal voted exemptions would still, a lot of cases be subject to the statewide education tax. And so they would probably be those properties would be put in one of these other categories, like commercial or whatever is appropriate.
Yeah.
Okay, next we have a definition for residential A. The short version is, why do we have residential A and B? This is something that the counties in Hawaii do. It's something that some other jurisdictions do in other places. If a residential property, and keep in mind, this is non-homesteads. I mean, it will be on the grand list for homesteads, but the tax difference is going to matter for non-homesteads. It's not going to matter for homesteads because we will continue to have a homestead tax rate, right? So residential A are properties worth less than $1 million. Residential B is properties worth more than $1 million. This distinction exists so that if you want to have a higher tax rate on residential properties, a higher non-homestead tax rate on residential properties that are worth a lot, you could do that. And then we have a resort definition. This is inspired by Hawaii. It's a little bit trickier in Vermont because the system in Hawaii is based off of municipal and county government. they are able to link in their zoning laws with their property valuation. So in at least one of the counties in Hawaii, they would say, we have a resort classification, and if it's zoned as resort, and we only want, we have a resort zone that the resorts have to be in, and we've decided this is the places where the resorts can be. And if you're there, you're called a resort, and then we're going to tax you as a resort. So it all matches up well for them because they're able to leverage their zoning laws. Nobody's talking about Vermont having statewide zoning and like having one, like, we're not. So that's not an option for us. We've got to figure out a different way if we want to create non-homestead resort properties differently for education tax. So here's our beginning of a definition.
And if folks remember, what's come up a bunch of times in the reappraisal conversations is how often resort appraisals are challenged and how hard it is to maintain those appraisal values in the face of various things. And so I think there's, even separate from sort of tax treatment, there's value in having it have its own bucket here.
So what we have is you start with properties that are licensed as hotels, lodging establishments, bed and breakfast, et cetera. And then also, if they're used as part of a ski facility, water park, amusement park, or golf course. And then I did add some clarifying language. In this case, the lodging facility and all associated facilities shall be classified as resort. And the resort shall not mean a complex that's primarily used for camping facilities. We don't want to accidentally throw private campgrounds in with that. And there might be some other things that as we hear from people that we want to be careful that they're not accidentally thrown in with. But that's what we have so far as hopefully the beginnings of a workable definition there. And then we have a definition for undeveloped. This is mostly out of the Lister handbook. Same thing as what we would call undeveloped right now. So an undeveloped parcel would include wooded land, shore lots, residential building lots, unimproved commercial lots, unimproved agricultural land, and parcel with buildings of little or no value, such as camps. There's a clarifying provision here in D. Condominium units shall be classified individually based on the actual use of the unit, because that will be a question that comes up. And then some more clarifying: farm buildings and improvements that are not used for a business purpose and are associated with residential property shall be classified along with residential property as residential A or B. That language gets at hobby farming if it's not if it's not actual part of a farm business, but you've got an old barn. You can't just, got to be cognizant of people trying to play the system to get themselves into a more favorable tax rate. And that's going to having a system like this means that there'll be human behavior around that. And so trying to address and make sure that you're not accidentally creating a favorable situation for maybe a group that you didn't want to do that for. So we have subsection E here, which is starting to get into one of the challenges in doing this kind of system, and that is not everything is clean and pretty in the real world, and not everything's obvious in how properties are used. So what do we do about mixed use and multiple use properties? So the way that this is drafted, it says a parcel with multiple or mixed uses shall be classified proportionately according to the areas of primary use. So on the grand list, you could have a property that is 30% residential, 20% undeveloped because it's undeveloped ag land, and 50% is like farm buildings that have a business use. So in that case, that property would be, we'll say Res A, commercial, and undeveloped. And then for the portions of it, they'll pay proportionally the tax rate for each of those three categories based on the proportion that the land is used in that way. So that's how it's drafted to try to deal with mixed use properties. And And then there's some clarifying language here. When determining the proportionality of a parcel with a mix of residential and other uses, each residential unit shall have a maximum of 2 acres dedicated to the house site, and any land exceeding the house site acreage shall be allocated toward the other uses of the property. This is meant to kind of coexist or to link up well, to be compatible with what we have for homestead declarations and house sites. So it's similar to how house sites are treated, where there's the 2 acres that are considered part of the house site, that's part of the homestead, and then the rest of the land isn't. This is a little different because you're calling that 2 acres the residential part, and then the rest of it is whatever other use is taking place will have to be put in with that. And that's just because you're going to run into questions of, well, we've got 3 different uses and we've got all this land around. Well, what part of it's residential? What part of it's commercial? Like, how do we divide that up? And so, and that's going to be a practical problem on the ground. And to be able to address that stuff in statute will be important. And that's why we have that provision. We may need a lot more than that as we hear from people in the field about all the different things that could come up. Might need a lot more clarifying language like that. That's the classification stuff that we have. The next part is the tax part and how it plays with the tax part. So we've got section 5402, which establishes the non-homestead and the homestead rates. The language has changed here, but the gist of it is the homestead rate and the way that homestead is done would stay the same. You would still be setting up, the General Assembly would still be setting a yield for the homestead. But then for non-homestead properties, for each of those classifications, annually, the way it's written right now, it could be in statute, but the way it's written right now, annually, the General Assembly would set rates for each of those and set yields for each of those different non-homestead classifications.
And so the idea here about having it multiplied by X is that we decide essentially once what we think the relationship between those property classes should be. And we can amend it in statute, sure, anytime, but that's sort of the hardest decision, right? And so we would decide that in statute, the relationship between the classes. And maybe this year we just decide they're all taxed the same, I don't know. And then, so the annual raising of revenue is just setting that one rate the way we do now, to raise enough amongst the classes. And so that's then a math exercise, not a values proposition each year. We would only have to do the values proposition ideally, once or every 10 years or whatever.
So to illustrate that, I've scrolled down to the first part is just about the homestead. The next several subdivisions are about each of those classes. If you decided, this is completely hypothetical, no policy suggestion here. If you decided though that the residential B, the high value residential properties should be taxed a lot more, residential A could say multiplied by 1. And then residential B could say multiplied by 2. That's one example. And the numbers you put here would, as the chair said, be proportional to how much of the burden do you want each of these classification groups to be responsible for.
Kirby, in this construct, if a property is worth $1.5 million, would 1 million be at A and everything over $1 million be at B?
If it's one property that's purely used as residential and there's no mixed use or anything else going on, the way it's written, the entire property would be B.
You're right.
But something to think about would be, let's say you take that same property and then someone finds a way to make a portion of that property used for a different purpose. Like let's say they start haying fields or something, and then it's like to think about how people might change their behavior to say to avoid having a high res B rate, say, and try to get a portion of their property to be considered something else in order to get that proportionality down where my $1.5 million property is now, well, the residential part of it's only worth 800,000.
Yeah.
So it could be tricky and
Okay.
people could respond.
Just try to figure out how it works.
Yeah. And really the rest of this is some conforming stuff. This section, the language, that's part of the language that's in this bill has to do with education, finance. I've heard something about education finances maybe getting changed this year, so we might
That's cute.
might need to, marry some of these things together by the end of the session.
So this section of conforming changes is also like John Gray has walked us through this section before, because there would need to be conforming changes here as well. Just the governor's proposed language has just one tax rate across the board.
Yeah, so that's it with the concept and with the substance that we have now for making that concept reality.
Clarifying questions from folks before we move to opinions. Yeah.
It's sort of on the line between
Yeah.
those two things. One question I had is the definition of commercial. Did that come from some precedent like Hawaii statute? I just thought it was curious that farming and office buildings were kind of in the same category with potentially short-term rentals. And those to me seemed like different things. Was that just taken from someplace else, or was that a choice? And if so, what is that choice?
A lot of that came from the Lister handbook and trying to put into place what's already the norm.
I think there's a question about if you apply current use to that, if that sort of gives it its own that gives farming its own category, or if it should be in its own category on its own, and then it creates sort of a duplicative process, because and so that's
Yeah,
it's a question.
because I was thinking more simplistically that, short-term rentals might be something we want to discourage, and office buildings might be something we want to encourage, as we're trying to do economic development in a town center or a portion of town. It just seems odd to me that they're in the same category.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And part of why I tried to call out some of these things, because you want to highlight those policy choices. It's as simple, if you want to move short-term rentals into another category, it's as simple as defining it that way, and you can do that.
So did you see in any of the statutes you looked at, for instance, this? Farms are required to meet certain, let's say, hard agricultural practices. They don't do that. Not all penalties are, but would we allow a farm that's really not complying with required agricultural practices, they're polluting water and so forth? Would we want to have something show up in this statute that would not allow them to have the treatment that's more preferential for farms?
I mean, you can make classification categories all you want. I mean, yeah, we could try to come up with something for that. I would say that the way this is drafted is it's really about how it's used, and it's about whether it's used for business or not. It's more of the question, not if they're doing a good job with their business or something like that. And also, going back to the chair's point from a minute ago, when it comes to the farming stuff, this is going to be something that current use is overlapped on. Like, it might not be relevant if at the end of the day, most of your property is just being valued under use value appraisal, and that system is what's really controlling your property tax bill. So the commercial farm stuff here is going to be for the instances where people aren't enrolled in current use for the most part, so where it's going to be relevant for them. And maybe that answers your question partly, because current use does have requirements. And if you're operating a farm where you're not doing it right under current use, and so you are a farm, but you're not enrolled in current use, this becomes more relevant for you.
Are we to the opinion piece or are we still?
Folks, does anyone have any other questions for Kirby? Okay, Kirby, thank you very much. Representative Higley, your opinion.
Yeah. So as a lister, not that I'm not hated already, but this would put me in a larger hate category.
Representative Higley.
And it would maybe even steer me towards the regional district advisors. Because I will be so busy dealing with all the different classifications and properties here, it would be unbelievable. But anyway, I could go on, but I can at some point talk about what we currently have to do. But it's, and thank goodness that my little town doesn't have a lot of commercial properties and resorts and, you know, industrial properties and all that. I mean, that's, yeah. So anyway. I understand, or I don't understand, I guess. I understand the concept, but it's certainly more complicated. You can't get away from saying that it's not more complicated. And especially even for my property taxpayers to try to figure out, what does this mean for me? Like you had said, a lot of people are going to try to figure out some way to game the system one way or the other. But anyway, that's just a few concerns at this point.
I think that some of the concerns that Rep. Higley raised, like, there's a lot of details here, and I think that there's a lot of upfront work that would have to be done if we pursue something like this. But in my opinion, this is an incredibly excited nerd committee. I find this so exciting. I think that this could be a really good tool to, you know, incentivize affordable housing, to get a better, you know, in Barrie, I always use the example, we have a bunch of affordable and non-affordable apartment buildings, out of state owners. We have industrial parks. We have old granite sheds. We have Nelson's, the small hardware store right on Main Street. And we have plenty of single family homes. And I just don't think it makes good tax sense to treat all of those properties as if they have the same value or the same ability to raise revenue. You know, there's a big difference between an undeveloped property, a resort, and a residential A or B or public use. Those all have very different abilities to raise revenue and to bring money in to the state, and the ability to pay money out to the owners of those. So I think that there is absolutely a lot of work and a lot of details to figure out here, but I think it's a really exciting tool.
Yes, if anyone else has a thing for.
I'll just say, and this addresses a concern I have, which is the carrying cost in our community of homesteads is so much greater than the carrying cost of a non-homestead, that we are literally incentivizing expansion of second homes and losing the income tax associated with those homes because we're crowding out working families. So I think this is a really exciting opportunity to make sure people actually can still live in Vermont in our side of the state. I would also encourage us to at least just make sure at some point we go through our exemptions and just make sure they're in line with our current priorities as well.
Appreciate that. Thank you. And we will hear from VHFA about what it means to define affordable housing. We will hear from the tax department at length about how this lines up with the existing grand list procedures that folks need to use. Yeah.
Also, again, I'll give you an example, and the previous PVR director and I had conversations about this, highest and best use, okay?
Yeah.
If you have, and I can give you an example, a 400-acre farm, the farmers went out of business, buildings are falling down, somebody came in and bought it for $1 million, okay? We had it in for $400,000. Now, the discussion was highest and best use, that land is selling for that, that next piece down the road sold for that, so we're gonna have to start looking at that. And I said, you gotta be kidding me, because there's another farm down the road who just went out too. They're living on Social Security, they have 400 acres of land. They don't have it in current use, and they're gonna have to pay on and on. And the second thing is, as listers, we do not assess for timber on the property. It used to be in the day where you assess timber that's on a landing,
Right.
but not anymore. And so what's the highest and best use? Is it for maple veneer logs? Is it for recreation, you know, trails, whatever? So again.
Don't you have that
so
problem under current law?
with the current law?
Yeah.
As far as,
Highest best use.
not so much yet, but I think if some of that sort of stuff were to kick in more, where PVR would consider some of these larger tracts of land that are going for sugar bushes to increase that price, that's where I'd have a huge issue, because again, there's still so many property owners And again, some of them that don't have it in current use for whatever reason they choose, it would be, they would have to sell to something. They just couldn't keep
And
it.
so I think that's an interesting question about, do we leave a category for us to discuss next week? Do we leave sort of open farmed managed land in the commercial category and assume the current use treatment, or do we create a separate category for it? It's, on sort of first drafting with Kirby, it seemed like, let's not touch current use because we have enough problems. But I mean, I think there's a real case to be made for folding it into the system. I really don't know.
This comes up in my area as well. And if you talk about, something that's not in current use, but it's just open land, some people argue that the highest and best use of that 100 acres sitting there is to divide it up into house lots. And then you've got a whole different, concept of what is the value of all that land as opposed to 100 acres just sitting there open.
And I think Vermont has repeated over and over and over again in our public policies that that's not the highest and best use of that land, that for the most part, the highest and best use of land outside of village centers is to be open managed land, right? And so certainly want to be cognizant of that as we do this work. I also just, I think the reality is that we're going to do significant other property tax reform this year. We're going to do significant education policy reform, education finance reform. And we will likely be able to stabilize the growth in property taxes. We are likely not going to be able to see a significant reduction in property taxes. And I think we've all seen the modeling that leads me to say that out loud, right? It's not like a brilliant breakthrough I just shared. And so I think we need to really be thinking how we can help our homestead property owners stay in their homes over the next few years and be able to afford to live in Vermont. And I see this diversification as a potential opportunity for that, but it's a lot of work ahead of us. So I just want to, I want to make sure everyone really reads this and sits with it over the week before we all put our flags in the sand on it. But yeah, sort of thoughts for us to bring into next week.
I really appreciate that. And I confess I'm going to ask Kirby some questions just to clarify my understanding already, but I hope we can also challenge conventional assumption. I hear what you're saying, that we protect open green space outside our downtowns. In our area, we're turning into Connecticut. I'm just telling you, because the housing pressures are so severe. We are literally getting a house every minimum unit that you can do. So it's every 5 acres or every 10 acres. That is not consistent with what we say we're doing. And I think by failing to address the reality of the housing crisis, we are actually advancing really poor development practices in the state. And I hope we can think about that and think about how our tax policy incentivizes that.
I wonder about industry, commercial, we talk about farms. What about industry? What about commercial things that are happening that are the economic growth and the economic engine of the state, and being sure that we do not put onto them too great a burden? Because, well, for many reasons, if you're employing people already, you have the burden of increasing healthcare costs because if you're paying for your employees' health insurance, you've got a lot on you now. So I just don't want, once we separate things out from each other, then
we're able to further protect those properties if that's what we want to do in policy.
yeah, all right, then I don't want to forget to protect those things so much.
Yeah, thank you. We started this discussion meeting last fall.
I feel like we started it like a decade ago.
For various points in time, we started the discussion, and I still agree, we're trying to figure out how to tax property fairly, appropriately. And what Kirby's done, gives us a pretty good model place to start. And as we've all said, there's a lot of decision points and things to be made, but this is a very good place to start, I think, and as Representative Holcomb has said, alluded, we need to make sure that we don't run contrary to what we say we think we're doing. Because we could easily get kind of tangled up in the weeds and come out in a place which is not recognizable. And so I just read this thing over the week and I maybe jot down some thoughts and see if they're consistent with what I think we're doing or what I think I'm doing. To the extent they're inconsistency, then how come? That's certain, place to go. But anyway, thank you.
Thanks. Oh, yeah.
I've never thought this much about property valuation, so I want to spend some time with this, the Lister's Handbook over
Mhm.
current use, and kind of look at the intersection of all those things and try to figure out what the issues are. Thanks for the opportunity to do that. It's going to take a little while. to do.
The more important thing, folks, we all have to think about what we're doing on the other end of things too. Okay, Act 59, conserving 30% of our land by 2030, 50% by 2050. That's huge. We have to talk about tier 3.
Mhm.
Okay? We have to talk about
And how
the
that.
bills that's, in environment right now, looking at wildlands. This is, you talk about protection, but protection without compensation. And it's huge. It's getting to a point, again, when you've got, I don't know, 75 to 80% of the property in Vermont privately owned. It's a real concern for me, and some of the wording in some of these proposals from VHCB and A&R when it talks about what they can do with private land. We've already done things with wetlands and shorelands and buffers, you name it. But I told them the other day, I said, if this continues as a lister, I'd like to see overlays of all this and take out every single piece of property that you can't do anything with, and you're not going to get taxed on it. So that's another thing you have to think about when we look at this.
Absolutely, we do. Folks, let's stop there. I don't want to give I want everyone to actually rest and have sort of slow, thoughtful thoughts and knit their broken bones and their immune systems and their bruises. And like take care of yourselves, please. But I think sort of the time for the slow thoughts about the big issues we are all working with. We have about 4 very large pieces of legislation in front of us that should all join together to form a bill. And so let's all come back sort of refreshed and ready to dive into those in 2 weeks. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.